There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
Back in 1965, Time Life Books published the Early Man volume for its Life Nature library. If you opened it up, you would find a fold-out illustration called The March of Progress by the artist Rudolf Zallinger. Zallinger died in 1995, but the March of Progress lives on, and it's been depicted over and over with different versions and parodies along the way. The illustration is actually titled The Road to Homo Sapiens, and over the years, it's drawn the ire and displeasure of some evolutionary biologists. Not because of the quality of the illustration, it's a beautiful work in both detail and the information it contains, but the problem some have with it is what it suggests: the road to Homo sapiens. It's as if that's what it's always been about. From the very beginning of life, it's all been about one thing: us. Well, not quite. In 1893, the German zoologist Wilhelm Haacke published Design and Inheritance. Haacke was a student of Ernst Haeckel and a proponent of Lamarckian inheritance, which, at its most basic, states that a parent can pass certain traits acquired during life down to his or her offspring. If you recall from an earlier episode, it's the concept of use and disuse, and has been used to explain why moles are blind and how giraffes developed long necks. In his book, Haacke took this further. Inherited traits, he explained, were passed down through germplasm. During an organism's life, external forces and the environment affect the germplasm and its structure. The sum total of these effects are then passed on. Haacke introduced another concept into the mix. He called it orthogenesis. Changes in organisms are directed toward perfection. It wasn't random. That would only produce failures, mistakes, and abominations. He said Charles Darwin was wrong in the assertion that natural selection played a blind role in the development of new species. Orthogenesis had an end goal. It was directed evolution. According to Haacke and others, it explained everything from the beauty of a butterfly's wings to the intelligence and brains of Homo sapiens. Haacke's ideas didn't fade away after his passing in 1912. Others picked up the torch and carried it forward. Most notably, the French Jesuit priest and paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. In his book, The Phenomenon of Man, published in 1955, the same year he died, Teilhard embraced evolution and coupled it with his idea that it would all culminate in what he called the omega point, the ultimate manifestation of being. It happens at the end of time. Teilhard didn't place human consciousness or Homo sapiens as the ultimate goal of evolution. It serves as a stepping stone to the omega point. Others, eschewing the idea of an omega point or an ultimate metaphysical being, instead focused on the more grounded ideas of orthogenesis, its march toward perfection. It was like Aristotle's ladder, where humanity stood on the topmost rungs directly below the Creator. In more recent years, recent being the last 70 years or so, the idea has come under a lot of heat. Evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr despised using terms that seemed to indicate evolution had a purpose or an end goal. He struggled with how to best convey the purpose of a biological adaptation without implying a supernatural force or direction. For him, it could all be explained in Darwinian terms. But not everyone has a problem with orthogenesis, most notably English paleontologist Simon Conway Morris, who points to examples of convergent evolution as being indicative of a direction. Were life to evolve on another planet, it's very likely it would evolve into something very much like you and me.
The underlying thesis of evolutionary convergence is that the number of so-called solutions, the ways of doing things and making organs or indeed behaviors or many other things, is surprisingly limited. Now, actually, if you if you have some familiarity with physics and chemistry, this is in its own way is not particularly surprising.
This is taken from an online presentation he gave for the Lumen Christi Institute in 2020.
With regard to humans, let me just mention perhaps three. One, for example, is to do with the way which we use our eyes, and they are based on a so-called camera system. There's a lot more to it than that, but effectively we have a lens suspended between two chambers. And as many of you will know, an almost identical arrangement has evolved independently, effectively, in the group known as the cephalopods, which are more familiar as the squid and the octopus. And they, of course, belong to the mollusks, which in turn are closely related to things like the oyster and, in fact, the earthworm. Whereas we are pretty closely related, I don't want to disappoint you, but that's the way it goes. We're pretty closely related to starfish. And our common ancestor back in the Cambrian, about 500 million years ago, would have had an eye spot, almost certainly, but nothing like a camera eye. So this arrangement has evolved along separate trajectories, but to very much the same endpoint.
With that being said, are there requirements in an evolutionary sense for developing into an organism like us? Well, Professor Conway Morris sees traits like warm-bloodedness and brain size as essential and evidence of an evolutionary path.
Another example, to do more with physiology, is that there's some reason to think that to be sort of an intelligent organism, by and large, you need to be warm-blooded. You need a stable body temperature to regulate sort of the physiologies and so forth. And it turns out that, once again, this warm-bloodedness is something which has evolved independently, most strikingly between the birds and the mammals. And then the third example I'd like to refer to very briefly is the increase in brain size. And this is something which, again, we see independently in a number of groups. Most strikingly, amongst parallels to the mammals, we see it in a number of the birds, especially the corvids, the crows, and also the parrots. And so these examples could go on. So in other words, there's a whole set of biological properties which are ones which you would expect an intelligent, sapient species to evolve towards, but in point of fact, on this planet alone, have evolved independently at least a number of times.
The question on the table has always been how. If evolution was a gradual process of slow changes toward perfection, or an omega point, then what was the mechanism behind it? What's the driving force? Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace had both independently identified the mechanism behind evolution and the creation of new species when they unveiled natural selection. Nature is the selective force, but it does so blindly and without purpose. If a variation introduced by mutation results in a trait that's beneficial to an organism's survival, and that organism lives long enough to reproduce and pass on that trait, then the organism's lineage survives. If not, well, the fossil record is peppered with organisms no longer with us. Organisms that had once benefited by the traits they inherited, but eventually faced environmental conditions and obstacles they couldn't compete with. That's natural selection. To say nature selects isn't implying it does so with purpose or a goal. It boils down to the individual and its ability to survive with the hand it's been dealt. Orthogenesis, on the other hand, implies a purpose or an end state. Nature still selects, but with orthogenesis, it's doing so with one eye open. In his 1986 book, The Blind Watchmaker, evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins answers the question about change with purpose. There is no purpose, nor is there a designer behind the scenes moving it forward with eternal patience. There is only life struggling to survive. The form it takes is driven by its genes and the random mutations which affect them. Take it away, Bill Nye, the science guy.
We live less than a century, a human does, but this process that brought us to be is billions of years old. And it's just really hard to get your mind around what that means. Billion years, 65 million years. And the other thing that's just out of our everyday experience as people, we design things and make them. We decide how big the piece of paper is. We decide how large our handwriting is going to be. Then we make an organization chart for our corporation, and then we hire people, and it's top down. It's idea down. But evolution doesn't work that way. Evolution is bottom up. Evolution is, in the poetic sense, organic. in the chemical sense, literally organic. All these systems emerge, all these living things emerge, and the good ones, the good designs eat the bad designs, and so there's no more bad designs, there's just good designs. Then the designs compete, and then they eat each other, and so you very quickly end up, people run computer models about this, you very quickly end up with an ecosystem and tuned species. It is out of our everyday experience.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Evolution Talk. I'm Rick Coast, and you can find show notes and source material and also ways to support this show at evolutiontalk.com. I'd love to hear from you. I hope your week is going well, and until next time, please take care of yourself.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.